Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This morning, the OECD launched the latest results from the 2018 cycle of the Teaching and Learning International Survey, otherwise known as TALIS. This is the second volume of results following the release of Volume 1 last year. TALIS is the OECD's way of taking the temperature of the teaching profession by asking teachers and school leaders about their working conditions and the environment of their schools and classes. The focus of this latest TALIS report is on teacher professionalism. And within that, we talk about teachers' perceptions of the value of their profession, their work-related well-being and stress, their job satisfaction, their employment arrangements, how much autonomy they have over their practice, and how they collaborate with their peers as a community of educators. So joining me today to present the results of this latest round of TALIS is Andreas Schleicher, Director of Education and Skills at the OECD. And please feel free to send any questions you have during the presentation, either to our email address, which is edu.contact@oecd.org, or alternatively, you can use the chat function that is in this webinar. And at the end of Andreas's presentation, we'll read out the questions. Also, the PowerPoint that Andreas is presenting will be made available online afterwards. So, Andreas, over to you.
Thank you, Henry, and welcome to all. These new results from TALIS in a world that is so radically different from the time in which we collected the data, which was back in 2018. We think that the data still provides powerful insights on how well our teachers and also our school systems are prepared to respond to the 2019 pandemic. And this pandemic hasn't stopped at national borders. It goes after people regardless of nationality, level of education, income, gender, but that for its consequences, which are likely to hit the most vulnerable hardest. And as always, education is not an exception here. Those from privileged backgrounds are going to find their way around closed school doors. They always find their way to alternative opportunities to the digital world. They're supported by parents and they understand why studying hard really matters. But those from disadvantaged backgrounds will remain shut out if the school. They may not have access to digital learning resources, or they may lack the resilience or even the engagement and motivation to learn on their own. In a way, the crisis has exposed the many inequalities in our education systems. From the broadband and computers that you need to, manage online learning, through the supportive environments that are needed to focus people on learning, up to our failure to attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, something that this TALIS survey has always highlighted. But while those inequalities are magnified in a time of crisis, this moment also holds the promise that we won't return to the status quo when we get back to normal. It's the nature of our collective and systemic responses to the disruptions. I'm going to determine how we are affected by them. From TALIS give us some real hope. But before talking about the results, let me say a few words about the study. It's the largest international survey on teachers. The view. This is basically talking about the voice of teachers. 48 education systems took part, and you can see the growth here across successive surveys. The map of the countries that are represented in the survey. All in all, we had 260,000 teachers taking part. So pretty much a good kind of sample size in most countries to get a quite nuanced and fine-grained picture of the views of teachers in different countries. We also surveyed school leavers. All of this took place in lower secondary education, some also in primary schools, but I'm going to talk mainly about results in middle school, lower secondary education. The framework that we use looks at, what systems do to attract great people into teaching, to develop them into effective teachers, to providing the supportive work organization that it takes to engage people and give them room for innovation, how systems empower teachers, and last but not least, how they retain them in the profession. That's sort of the framework that underpins the design of the instruments. But with this background, let's go into the radical changes that we observe today. Are our schools prepared to respond to a crisis that we have never seen before at this scale? School closures have always happened at local levels, but what you can see here on the map that was drawn together by UNESCO is that it's now everywhere. Some countries have shut down schools nationwide, and others are doing this localized, but pretty much it's a global phenomenon that we need to look at. And obviously, technology is one way in which we can bridge school closures, at least temporary. And many schools are now equipped with at least the minimum of the technologies that you need for online learning. You can see here on the chart that a quarter of school principals in TALIS, on average across the countries that took part, said that shortage or inadequacy of digital technology was hindering learning quite a bit or a lot. And you can see this figure ranges from less than 2% in Singapore. It's not an issue for school leaders there. Schools are very well equipped. So 30% in countries like France, where I live, or Italy, and then over 80% in the country like Vietnam. Variability in how well, and it shows you something about the inequalities, but the length of the bar in each country also talks about the inequality within a country. Some schools are really well equipped, other schools are struggling just with the basic technological infrastructure. And in a way, those figures might even understate the problem, because not all principals may be aware of the opportunities that modern technology could provide for instruction. So in a way, what you see here may just be the tip of the iceberg. And also, technology as it is actually being used. And what you can see is that 53% of teachers let their students frequently or always use ICT for projects or classwork. So roughly of the teaching force has made it kind of a new normal that students are working with digital technology. But the other half does not. That varies quite a bit. Countries like Denmark or New Zealand, you have this being kind of fairly standard practice in 80% or more of the situations. You can look at Finland here, Israel, Romania, where you can see those numbers have more than doubled in over the 5 years leading up to the survey. We did this last time in 2013. So it's different. Some countries moving rapidly forward, but you can see that even the basic infrastructure is an issue for many schools. And what you can say basically, and where there has been no practice before the crisis, schools are going to have a hard time to establish this practice in the crisis. And you can also hear that, compare this with other teaching practices. You can basically hear the percentage of teachers who frequently or always use a certain type of practice. Now, teachers are pretty well familiar with classroom management. That's what they do really well, with instruction. To some extent, with cognitive activation, give tasks that require students to think critically, have students work in small groups to come up with a solution. Those kinds of tasks, cognitive activation, are very, very important. I'm going to come back to this later on. But when you look at again, let students use ICT for projects or classwork, that's not so common yet. And then all projects that require at least 1 week to complete. Think about this crisis. Self-regulation become much more normal. Students need to be able and have the environment where they actually work on their own for sustained periods of time. And in non-crisis time in 2018, that was pretty rare in across countries that we surveyed here. Again, it's a lot of variability across countries, but the kind of 21st century learning that is now so important is something where we are quite far away from this. Training, of course, the big question is, where do teachers learn the kind of new skills? Here you can see the percentage of teachers for whom different types of topics were included in the professional development in the 12 months prior to the collection of the data. And then also in yellow, I've marked share of teachers who report a high level of need. You can see here is, yeah, you know, there's a pretty good number of teachers who have basically done some training on this in the last 6 months, or 60%. And are very high, 18%, and you can see that second only to teaching students with special needs. And those are the two areas, technology, special needs, that teachers really feel they need to be better prepared. Those are exactly the needs that need to be amplified in this moment of crisis. Students with special needs, also the kind of student who responds well to kind of standardized, template-based kind of digital learning environment, they'll be fine. But students who have special needs, who learn different ways, who require more attention, they're most at risk. And then also skills for ICT. So this is something I think we need to take to heart. There is a lot that needs to be done. Now, one of the things you can see that younger teachers are ones where training was more included. When you looked at teachers who completed their training in the last 5 years, you can see basically those rates, inclusion rates are much higher, and they're much more consistent across countries. You can pretty much say most countries have now got to grips with this. But, you know, this is just the incoming teacher cohort. The people who are in the profession lag off behind. Look at the end of the spectrum, a country like Spain. For new teachers, technology is part of their training, but for the people in the workforce, that is still more the exception than the norm. So this of skills needed to equip all teachers with the skills to use technology in a way in which it is necessary. What is very interesting is when you actually see teachers who were trained, they're also using technology more. So actually, a lot of the training that is provided now seems to have an impact on capacity of teachers and their attitudes, because both matters when you actually lose it. But also that impact varies across countries. Now, in some countries, that relationship is stronger and others less so. It's very hard to read too much into this, but it could be that in countries where the relationship between training and use is strong, the training may be quite relevant and useful. But again, it does seem to make a difference. I think all of this shows public policy can make a difference. Now, where we provide education and training for teachers in new technologies, there seems to be using this. When you come to the nature of training, this is quite interesting, where we looked at, you know, how actually teachers do their professional development. You can see a lot of this is courses and seminars in person, reading professional literature, but participation in professional networks and also online courses. That's probably now the only way how we can reach teachers in this moment of crisis. And you can see those are the kind of categories where training provision seems to be still less developed. So I said we need to do. But you know, the heart of educational success is not technology. It's about people. It's about empowerment of teachers. So we have looked in quite some ways to understand what is behind it. And let me just show you here, pretty confident that they have control over the immediate practice. Over 90% of teachers on average control the choice of teaching methods, the way they assess student learning, over discipline, overall. And a little less are, you know, involved in deciding overall course content, sort of the what questionnaire. You can see that's where prescription is often stronger. But then when you get to getting involved in school management, there is actually a lot less involvement of teachers into this. But more or less, you can say when it comes to, you know, immediate classroom, teachers seem to be confident that they have the kind of professional autonomy and control. When it comes to being part of the work organization of school, the picture doesn't look so good. And also that is something that, for example, determining course content. You go on the left side in Sweden, Iceland, Norway, Korea, Netherlands. Now this is kind of the norm, that teachers, basically virtually all teachers agree or even strongly agree that they have control over what they teach in their class. If you go to the right side, to Portugal, to Malta, to England, to Alberta in Canada, you can see actually feel less sort of, whereas the curriculum is pretty strong and teachers have less kind of room for maneuver. So this varies also across countries. Now, what you do in the classroom, the other is how much discretion does the system actually give to teachers to be innovative. In this moment of crisis, what we need most is teachers who are designing new learning environments. This is not about replicating what I did in a classroom in a kind of digital environment. This is very much about thinking about learning, new ways of teaching, new ways of collaborating with students. It's really about the design of innovative learning environments. Now, how can we use the people, the spaces, the time, the technology in a way that we can actually walk through this crisis? And the picture actually looks positive than kind of industrial work organization may suggest. You have basically 4 out of 5 teachers. They strive to develop new ideas for teaching. When you actually look at this now, it's a very positive perception by teachers about their colleagues. You can see that most teachers in the school strive to develop new ideas for teaching and learning. That's supported, that statement is supported by 80% of teachers across. Most teachers in the school provide practical support to each other for the application of ideas. Again, innovation always happens in a collaborative environment. And you can see to be a climate of mutual support, at least in the perception of teachers. Most teachers in the school search for new ways to solve problems, and most teachers in the school are open to change. That's not what sometimes heavy bureaucratic structure of our school system suggests, but there seems to be a lot of potential on which this crisis can draw. A lot of people who see themselves as open to new ideas and who see their colleagues to be supporting them in this. So I think that's something we should take to heart. There's a lot of kind of potential in our education system. Again, it varies. You go on the left side to Georgia, to Vietnam, to Shanghai, to Bulgaria, the United Arab Emirates, and so on, where you can see basic teachers typically agree or strongly agree that most teachers are open to change and search for new ways to solve problems. When you go on the right side to Belgium or Portugal, that's sort of less kind of prevalent. So but overall, I think I was very heartened when I saw these results first, that actually there seems to be a lot of willingness and openness in the profession to do things in new ways, in innovative ways. When it comes to leadership in school, there seems to be room for greater reliance, untapped latent potential, and more active support from principals. You can see here, on average, only 59% of principals take actions to support cooperation among teachers to develop new teaching practices. In this crisis, you would want every principal to build that kind of support for teachers to take on risks, to try out new things, to learn from each other, to develop new and innovative practices. So leadership, I think, is something that is going to be tested in this environment. Perhaps the greatest risk in this crisis is that the social fabric that is created in and by schools is going to become fractured. Learning is never a transactional process, where students are passive consumers of content, where schools are service providers, and where parents are clients. The right way to look at education. Learning always happens through social interaction. And it always happens in an environment of well-being and self-efficacy of both learners and teachers. And that's probably the hardest thing to maintain in this crisis. Now, how do teachers, remain in contact with their students? How do students remain in contact? How families and teachers work together to develop education? That's, I think, the biggest challenge. And where you lose it is going to be very, very hard to rebuild. The success of students over the coming weeks and months, and particularly those from disadvantaged groups, will critically hinge on maintaining a very close relationship with their teachers. So in a way, the challenge is to remain socially close when people are physically apart. And the good thing is that actually this becomes quite natural to teachers. When we ask teachers, why did you want to become a teacher? You can see actually the strongest motivation is a social one. 9 out of 10 teachers, they joined the profession to make a difference to the lives of children. 3/4 expressly refer to the opportunity to benefit the socially disadvantaged. That comes all before the kind of material conditions. So that social motivation that is in the teaching force is something that now, in this moment of crisis, education can build on. Teachers went into this because they want to make a difference to their lives. They want to be connected to their students. They teach children, not subjects. Again, that I think is a very kind of positive outcome from the TALIS survey. But then, special needs students, they are again most likely to fall. And actually, when you survey school leaders in normal times, now again, the survey was carried out in 2018, you could already see a shortage of teachers with competence in special needs students. Number 2, a shortage of teachers with competence in a multicultural setting. Now think about students from different language backgrounds now who will not be able to follow, the instructional system that is now delivered electronically in the language of instruction. They're going to need a lot of support. Shortage of teachers with competencies in disadvantaged students. Those are real issues. And what you can see here is the percentage principles that say already in regular times, 2018, quality instruction was hindered or a lot by those kinds of shortages. Areas that are going to be of particular, they already back when things were normal, a kind of issue for schools. This is something education systems will make learning more tailored to the special needs of students, to understand that different students learn differently, sometimes differently at different stages of their development, and to embrace that diversity with differentiated pedagogical practice. And here you can see also again how this varies across countries. Now 1 in 5 teachers report a high need for professional development in teaching students with special needs. Again, less in some countries, more so in others. And this is something that troubled us most when we analyzed this data. What you can see here really is that when we look at new teachers, we often send them to the schools that are in the greatest difficulties, now that have greatest concentration of students from disadvantaged homes, or a greater concentration of students with an immigrant background. So in a way, we make it hardest for the newest teachers and replace experienced teachers into the schools with less problems. And again, that's going to hit us in this moment of crisis, where we really need the most experienced, most talented people to support the most disadvantaged learners. There are very few countries that have been able to turn that around, that have created devices to put good resources, great teachers in difficult schools. In most countries, resource allocation is still regressive. And this crisis is no doubt going to amplify this. The moment you replace people with technology, even temporarily, you're going to see those differences being amplified by this. But not least, you can see very few novice teachers actually have a mentor. If you go to the UAE, to South Africa, to Kazakhstan, to Singapore, it's quite normal that basically teachers have a mentor, and particularly the new teachers. Or look at Shanghai, the #1 actually on this now. But you can see others. If you do go to Slovenia or Lithuania or Italy or Spain, you're a new teacher, you're going to end up in a school, often a school, and at least not in the sense of a formal arrangement. You may have some friends who help you informally, but it's not part of the system. So new teachers are often left on their own devices. Countries also experienced teachers. This is something, in a way, in the 21st century, you would want every teacher to be a mentor and every teacher to be mentored. Long way to go. Teacher-professor collaboration. In this moment of crisis, we can rely less on the kind of vertical organization of education. Now, even the best education minister in this moment cannot solve the problem of 10,000s of schools, of 100,000s of teachers, of millions of students. We need to be able to find the good ideas in the classroom and mobilize and share and spread them. Some schools are going to do amazing things and are already doing amazing things to use technology to bridge, school closures. this is now something that we need to mobilize, to share, to spread across the system. Moving from vertical knowledge flows to lateral knowledge flows. I already talked professional autonomy, but it's going to be the combination of professional autonomy and a collaborative culture that is going to make a huge difference. And what you can see, there is already a lot of informal exchange among teachers. Now, 61% of teachers discuss development of students with colleagues on a regular basis, or almost half frequently exchange teaching materials. That's great. But when it comes to the deep level of professional collaboration, it really matters just self-efficacy. And we can see in the data, you see only 28% teach classes as a team at least once a month, and only 9% routinely observe colleagues and give feedback. Varies hugely across countries. Some countries do a lot better than this. But overall, we do not yet have a culture of deep professional collaboration. Our education systems are very atomistic. Teachers are often in isolation in the classroom. And in this moment, we need teachers who are connected and integrated into a system, who are the education system. So again, a long way to go for this. And you can see all across countries, in countries like Austria, Italy, Japan, Mexico, team teaching is now becoming more common. You can see classroom observation. You go to Vietnam, now 80% of teachers say they engage in the following activities in their school at least once a month. If you participate in professional collaborative learning, Shanghai, 2/3 of the teachers do that on a regular basis. But you look at the average picture, it's pretty low. And you can see some countries is close to zero. So you can see really here, this collaborative culture on which we now depend. Now is the moment to work with each other. That is the culture that we still lack. And hopefully what progress we achieve in this moment of crisis is something that we'll be able to retain when things go back to normal, because that is the future of education, move vertical to lateral kind of ways of collaboration and accountability. What's interesting is that the adoption of effective teaching practices, like cognitive activation. We know from research that practices related to cognitive, getting students to think critically, to question, to basically be present in the kind of environment, those actually are positively predicted by different forms of collaboration. So the collaborative culture that we see in school seems to be also related to practice, not just teacher networking, but better instructional practice. But once again, this is not about sharing, exchange of resources. This is about deep professional collaboration. And we can see the same thing with principals. Like in this moment of crisis, get schools connected, to collaborate, to solve problems together. And you can see in some countries that's a quite established practice on the left side, in Romania, South Africa, Korea. But on the right side, you go to Japan, the Czech Republic, or the capital region in Argentina, you can see actually very few principals work with other principals on challenging work tasks in the last year. So again, this collaborative culture is something that also at the level of school leaders is going to be very, very important. It's really about reducing pressure on teachers, like the health workers. This is the moment where teachers are going to be even under greater pressure to, to pursue their work. All of the problems of society always end up on the doorsteps of teachers in schools. And so we studied in quite some detail what causes those kinds of pressures. The first to think about is teaching, and you can see actually when you increase the average number of hours on teaching, you get teachers experiencing a little bit more stress in their work. Now you can see this line, but not very steeply so. When we increase the number of hours that teachers need to do individual planning or preparation of lessons, often work where they're disconnected from their colleagues, you can see that line goes up more steeply. When you think about marking, even greater. And when you think about administrative work, you can see even slight increases in the number of hours that teachers need to do administrative work related to huge stress. Well, teachers are actually quite comfortable with what they went into for this job, working with students, teaching, helping children to develop, to grow, to learn. But when we push things on teachers that have actually very little to do with their core mission, they actually perceive this to be, it's causing stress. So that's something to think. And of course, again, in this moment of crisis, there's a great risk that our systems, now particularly systems with low levels of trust, are going to end up with more control and more accountability and more structures and pressures. What amplify levels of stress according to the data that we collected in the 2018 period. What I want to make is about the need to raise the social status of teachers. In these days, have praise a lot the health workers. They solve the immediate after situation of the crisis. They work day and night to make sure save the lives of people. But there's also teachers who day by day do a very, very difficult job to help young people realize their dreams and build our future. And what you can actually see is that only 26% of those teachers feel that they are valued by society. And that and it varies across countries. If you are in Vietnam or Singapore, UAE or Korea, you can see 2/3 or more teachers actually feel that society values their work. They feel that what they do every day is really appreciated. But when you go to the right side of the chart, go to the Slovak Republic, to Belgium, France, to Argentina, Portugal, and so on, you can see 1 in 10 teachers who feel, or less, who feel that society will appreciate their work. And it's, this is not just about culture. You can see actually quite big changes in this. You look to Canada or Shanghai, which have moved to from good to great on this scale. Now a teacher felt already, appreciated now even more so. Or you look to Estonia. But there are other countries where it seems to go on the opposite route. New Zealand, for example, the perceived value of Belgium or Chile. So this, I think, is something we should do better on. I hope that, in this crisis, we will feel the kind of work that teachers do, not just to educate students, but also to help rebuild the social fabric in our societies. And you hope that in the next TALIS survey, we're going to see a lot longer bars for most of the countries here. That's all I wanted to do, and forward to your questions.
Thank you, Andreas. And as Andreas just mentioned, this is now the time for a bit of a Q&A. So we have had a few questions come in already, but just want to remind everybody that you can send your question into the chat function. So the first question, actually, the person has started by thanking you for highlighting the stress caused by general administrative work. This person is a teacher. And then the question is, I wonder if you can comment on the reasons why very few principals work with other principals.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, and it's also something that varies. Some countries do have a strong cultures for principals to work, but often our school systems are very atomistic. There is often no natural reason for schools to collaborate. There are no shared resources that schools manage collectively. Schools have an individual relationship with the local authority or the Ministry of Education, and that's worth to change. I think in most of our economies, it's collaboration is really the source of innovative practices, and I do think that's something for education systems to reconsider. What I like in Finland, for example, I'll give you an example. If you're a school leader there, you spend 2/3 of your time in your school and you spend 1/3 of your time in the local authority. So you are the education system. That's why you work with your colleagues to actually frame good practice. And I think we could do more of this. We could create more shared environment and spaces for school leaders to come together to design the system rather than just, to implement it locally in their school. But I think it's a very acute problem that these TALIS results highlight.
Next few questions relate a little bit more to the COVID crisis. This one says, in a context of problems of accessibility to internet, such as in Mexico, it's been pointed out in this question, the person points out that 43.6% of Mexican families do not have access to the internet. How can we face the challenge of keeping some kind of teaching at a distance?
Yeah, you know, I think the equity challenge, this crisis is going to magnify and amplify the equity-related challenges. Now, the immediate response of most people is, okay, we're going to implement, you know, digital learning environments. It will work for those who have access, and even there, you know, disadvantaged students often engaged. They have no one at home who's going to follow up with them, to push them to keep learning. They may not have the intrinsic motivation. They may not see the value in school. So there's going to be a lot of people falling through the cracks if we just roll out digital learning environments. So I think that's the first thing, even where we go digital, to ensure that we respond to the needs of students and keep that relational kind of aspect, teachers actually remaining connected with their learners very actively. And then you have those students who do not even have access to technology. Fortunately, according to the data that I showed you, that's in most countries a minority, but that minority exists. What I do know is when the crisis struck first in China, for example, they went to great pains to actually make sure that students who were at home could at least, you know, the schools were sending textbooks and materials to them. So the schools in the school system took great effort actually to equip students without access to adequate technology with at least traditional learning materials. I think that's something we must not lose, those young people from the radar screen who are not connected to the digital age. No.
Another question on the COVID crisis. Someone has asked, what would be the most powerful things governments could do now to support schools through COVID-19?
Well, you know, I think the most important and immediate things is really to make sure that digital means are connecting teachers and students and provide ways for students to learn. And I think this is something, again, you know, the experience of China is very powerful here. You could see within a month, they have got 50 million learners online. They created they involved, you know, public-private partnerships where everybody, you know, pulled their efforts together to build the kind of platform where students could connect. So that's a quick win. And I do think that's sort of perhaps the most urgent part. But I want to come back to the, you know, relational dimension that I mentioned. The most important part then, you know, when you have solved the kind of infrastructure issues, is to see that teachers and students can actually continue to work together, that there is a good kind of relationship between teachers and learners. And I think governments can do a lot to create the kind of collaborative environment for this to happen, connecting teachers with students. I personally, I do see this risk of the crisis in this, people who are going to get isolated, and, you know, students who have never seen so much meaning in school will get disengaged. They will pursue other things, and it's going to be hard to actually reach them. And that's something in a way that is very, very urgent to build, to rebuild the social fabric that is created by schools. We can rely, as you could see from the results, on a great level of motivation among teachers. Now, that's why people became teachers. Now I think governments should give them the means and the tools to actually realize those ambitions.
Okay, moving away slightly from the COVID crisis, someone has asked, how do the results from TALIS relate to PISA, that's the Program for International Student Assessment, or how in general do teacher outcomes relate to student outcomes?
That's a hard nut to crack. I must say, you know, we are just at the beginning, at the surface, understanding this. Within TALIS, you could see, for example, I showed you some results where professional collaboration connects with the prevalence of important teaching practices like cognitive activation. So I do think what teachers do and how teachers work has a lot to say about, you know, innovative practices. We also see that the collaborative culture that is prevalent in particularly the East Asian countries is perhaps one of the reasons why student-teacher relationships are strong in those countries, and maybe also why results are very good. But I think that's where we are just at the very beginning to understand the direct connection between what teachers do and the learning outcomes that are ultimately achieved. So it's not so straightforward to connect the PISA and the TALIS results in a scientific way. I think the way to look at this, the way we look at this, is we look at the highest performing education systems and then look at what makes them different in the TALIS results. But that doesn't tell us much about the causal nature of those relationships.
Okay. Next question is on professional development. Someone has asked, how does an effective professional development system for teachers look like nowadays? How should it look, in your opinion?
Well, actually, we have good research in the OECD on this. Part of the answer is the initial professional development, making sure that we focus professional development on few people who are really educated well. Now, there is a pyramid where entry to teacher education is selective. Teachers are educated really well. Clinical practice right from the start, so that teachers have a good sense of how their work is going to look like in the future. Most countries can also strengthen that in the future and build more clinical practice into initial teacher training. But that's the easy part. The harder part really is about continued professional development. Your students are not going to be lifelong learners if they don't see their teachers as lifelong learners. So basically integrating learning into the teacher working day starts with work organization. In many countries, teachers have actually very little time to do other things than teaching. You look to some of the highest performing education systems, you go to Japan, you go to China, actually teachers spend a lot of time on things other than teaching. They may teach, 11, 12, 15 hours, but they work a lot more hours. So professional development is one of those. Professional learning communities is another means. Research, teachers being actively engaged in the research of pedagogical practice. So in a way, you ask, how should we see good professional development today? I think the best indicator is that we don't even see it, that it's so well integrated into the daily work of teachers that my research and my practice, my self-awareness to classroom observation and my improvement, the feedback loops, the appraisal, all of this is integrated into the daily practice rather than sending off to courses or training workshops. I think that's really the sign of effective professional development, that learning is built into teaching. Technology also here can be a powerful amplifier. Basically, technology can give us much more immediate feedback on teaching practices. Teachers can see how different students learn differently through modern technology. So I think this is also an opportunity there.
Quite a number of questions now. Just if I don't get to your question, I apologize. We have quite a long list, so we'll get to as many as we can. The next one is also on professional development. How far should teachers have control over the kind of training they get while on the job? I.e., how can we balance what a government thinks teachers need to know with what teachers themselves think they need to learn?
I think it's probably less a question of what individual teachers think they need, but more a question of what the profession thinks they need. For individual teachers, probably, they should have control over this, but it's sometimes hard to make judgments. What you would like to see is that the profession as a whole is more engaged in designing, professional development and access to this and the distribution of it. And that's something I think that is still lacking in most countries. You have individual teachers and you have the government. But I do think professional bodies of teachers are often missing in this picture. Now, I think professionals should own their professional practice, as we take it for granted in other ways. Scientists are very, very good at that. They are organized in different ways, and they are shaping their kind of professional practice, their standards, their all of this. And I do think that's perhaps where I would see more of the answer, how the profession as a whole can design its professional practice, and then teachers will, adopt it rather than, we just offer more opportunities and then teachers make individual choices. I think there needs to be quite good guidance, and teachers need to have also the means to assess the quality of professional development.
Okay, and the next question, how can societies improve the recognition of the teaching profession? So I guess that relates to the value of the teaching profession.
First of all, we do see that there's a lot of variability across countries in this, and I do think there are several aspects. One is money, very, very clear. In most countries, teachers are not particularly well. The salaries of teachers do not compare well to salaries for people with similar qualifications. But I don't think it's just about making teaching financially more attractive. The bigger part of the problem is probably making teaching intellectually more attractive. Once again, we have, in one way, commodified education quite a bit, where students become consumers, teachers become service providers, parents become clients. And that obviously doesn't contribute to the status of the teaching profession.
If you go back in time, teachers were the center of society. Schools were the center of communities, and teachers had a very broad range of responsibilities. It was not just about delivery of instruction, but it was really about counseling, guidance, the relational aspect very, very strong. I do think parents will notice this, the kind of tailorization in work organization that we have seen over the last decades has probably not contributed to raising the status of the teaching profession. So how can we change it? Well, I think it's about creating greater career diversity, not creating between students, teachers, and parents, and building greater awareness of society and public recognition, something that government could happen. We do actually very, very little. When actors do a great job, everybody's going to recognize them. When teachers do a great job, very few people notice it. Rarely gets out of the school. I think the public recognition element is also important. But again, I wouldn't focus all energy on this. I think it's really the work organization. The status of a profession is often a reflection of the way in which the work is organized.
Apologies to everyone listening. We're just trying to fix the technical problems. The question was, can we link the support teachers receive and their well-being to the performance of their students?
Well, that's the difficult question to answer with TALIS. TALIS is just giving us the view of teachers, but the fact that many of the questions that teachers answered, professional collaboration, support they get, were related to the job satisfaction of teachers, to their degree of self-efficacy, and those factors probably have some, most likely are going to have some impact on what teachers do and how teachers teach. The relationship, for example, between professional collaboration and the increased use of cognitive activation strategies, all of those are indicators that the environment in which teachers work has an impact on what teachers do, and what teachers do is most likely to shape the outcomes that we achieve. But once again, we cannot directly link the results from TALIS with PISA because the survey was taken separately.
Okay. Well, it seems that the audio is now playing ball a little bit more, so apologies again to everybody for audio trouble. We've got more questions coming in though, so this next one says, one question on teacher working conditions. How do these work for or against the improvement of teacher performance, participation in training, etc.?
Difficult to answer. What we do see is that they're interrelated. Career structures, appraisal, feedback relate to the professional practice, at least according to teachers. Teachers actually responding generally very well to feedback and appraisal that is formative in nature. So most teachers looking for more and better feedback. I think that's clearly an obvious part of the answer. I do think work organization, career support, professional training, the fact that most teachers say when they got training, it actually made a difference in terms of instructional practice. I showed here the example of technology, but I could have shown you other examples. All of these things, I think, suggest that the work organization that we provide, the way we frame the work of teachers, is really quite influential.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question, and maybe we can get this in before we have more audio trouble. Someone has asked, again, relating to the COVID crisis, do you see some of the adaptations put in place in school to respond to COVID remaining in place even after the crisis is over? Technology being one example, but maybe others too.
Well, I would hope so. I do think, this crisis pushes us to think harder about, how education systems can become more resilient, more adaptive, how they can respond to new technologies. And I would hope that some of this is going to remain with us. And I'm quite sure that, innovative practices, if we can share and spread them really well, will be a driving force also for the period after. And in a positive way. I do think, after the crisis, we're going to have, a lot of work to rebuild education systems. Things will get lost, but I do think there will be positive effects as well. Technology use being one of them, but I do think also work practice, teacher networks. I'm sure, where, authorities are not going to, fix every little problem in school anymore. Teachers and school leaders are going to get together to take a greater level of responsibility, and I think those could be positive forces that we can see afterwards.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you to all of our participants for your interest in this topic, in TALIS, and in the OECD's work on education in general. If you would like to find out more about the latest TALIS results, you can head to our website, oecd.org/education/TALIS. This webinar has been recorded and will also be made available on our YouTube page, which is EduSkills OECD. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and until the next webinar.
Thank you, Henry.